Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, joined as always by
Annie Berglund. All right, Sam. So the first exam happened. Were there any takeaways? What went well? What could go better?
Yeah, I would say generally the first exam went pretty well for most students. The big things I would say in terms of advice, because we have two more exams, they're going to kind of be that same format. One thing is, for some folks, it seemed clear that they kind of ran out of time for the essay portion of the exam. So two ways to handle it. For one thing, you could just write the essay first. You could say, well, if I have 70 minutes for this exam, I'm going to give myself 25 to write the essay, set a timer for 25 minutes and just do the essay first to make sure you're giving all of that time. Or you could, at minimum, go and read that essay question first to say, okay, now I know what this question is. So when I'm taking the rest of the test, the back of my head is thinking about it. And then I can even start to mine other parts of the test that might help me with the question if there's a term or something that comes up there that's helpful. The other thing that I would say, because I think the big area that folks missed points on was the essay question. And as I'm thinking about kind of what the struggles maybe were with the essay question, make sure you read the question carefully and you answer each part of the question. I know that for some folks, and again, some of this was running out of time, but like there were parts of the question that didn't get answered, or there was just missing the overarching, this is what the question is asking. Sometimes in my feedback, I would remind you this is actually the theme of what the question's asking. The other thing that I would say is be really explicit when you're answering each part of that essay. It may not be the most beautiful kind of writing, but if you're really clear, I'm going to answer this part of the question, then I'm going to answer this part, then I'm going to answer this part. As I'm grading it, it becomes clear this is what you were talking about. Because I think sometimes as people were writing, I could read it and be like, I think I know what you're trying to say, or you seem to be hinting at this part of the question, but you're not really explicitly answering it, or you're not fully answering it. So being very clear, that also is a way for you to kind of check off to yourself, yes, I did address each part of the question. So those would be things to think about. I would say if you have other questions about how to improve on the next exam, feel free to email me, s-mulberry@bethel.edu, and I'd be happy to either email back or set up a Zoom call to talk a little bit more about that if you want help for the next exam. Annie, we are on to Unit 2, and we are on to the Middle Ages. And I want to think about that phrase, Middle Ages. Why middle? What might be misleading or even dismissive about the phrase Middle Ages?
Sure. So why Middle Ages is that the Middle Ages kind of implies a before and an after, right? So there's the start and the beginning and the end. So we have an implication that the time before the Middle Ages was significant, the time after the Middle Ages was significant, and then in the middle it's just kind of mid, right? Like there's not much happening. It's stagnant. There's a lack of progress in economics and politics, philosophy, art, literature, culture in general. So it's describing the time period after the fall of Rome in around 476 CE until the Renaissance period in the mid 14th century. So that's about 1,000 years that we define as the Middle Ages. And they've also been called the Dark Ages or the Barbarous Ages. So all of those are quite negative terms, Middle Ages being the least of the negative, but still it's implying it's kind of a dismissive term for that time period to say, oh, for about 1,000 years, it was mostly just like peasants being peasants. And there wasn't a lot of development, not a lot of growth. And in CWC, we talk about how that actually says a little bit more about the people who came after the Middle Ages than it does about the people in the Middle Ages who wouldn't have called themselves middle, right? So the people who came after it, who coined this term, were in the Renaissance period, right? Renaissance humanists, which you'll learn about a little bit later, they look back on greatness of the Greco-Roman world, and they want to emulate that time period. And they look at this period after Rome fell, the greatness of Rome, all of its legacy, and they call this period middle because there's nothing really that's significant to them as Renaissance humanists. They say, there's not really a great military leader that we should exemplify. There's not really any artistic movements that are compelling. There's not a lot of human accomplishment, which is so important in the Renaissance period, is individual and human accomplishment. And so you have, especially Italian Renaissance humanists, looking back at their own history in Italy and saying, we're actually different from the generations that are living in the Middle Ages. We're more like the great ancients. We're like the Greco-Romans who did have military expansion, who created these different forms of governance, who excelled and propelled our culture in interesting ways. We're not like the middle time period. So this is dismissive because there are actually great cultural achievements. It's a 1,000-year period, and there's not a decline of high culture. In fact, there's a lot of interesting developments that we talk about in this very unit. So it's misleading because we have people like Francis of Assisi starting a monastic order. We have great philosophical thinkers digging into the past and into the ancient Greek philosophies, but also contributing in their own way. People like Aquinas and Averroes. We have monks and mystics like Hildegard that are writing down these great ideas coming from their visions about the church. So there is a lot of cultural significance in this time. You also have a medieval warming period. So like there's a lot more food that's happened, and there's expansion of people. So there is a lot of achievement during this time. And it's also a period of habitation. So I'm not sure if this has been talked about in this class, but there's this idea that human history boils down to epochs or eras of homelessness and habitation. Homelessness being a time of chaos, of instability. Maybe there's warfare. Maybe there's a pandemic or an epidemic. Maybe there's economic collapse, or maybe everything all at once, right? And so it's a time period where as individual human beings, we feel like the world around us is crumbling and we don't have a roof over our heads. We don't have support. And then there's a time of habitation that comes after those times of chaos, where we start to create order again. We start to feel safe as a society. And this time period of the Middle Ages is a time of habitation. It comes after the chaos of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And we create a new way of living. And that is exemplified through hierarchy. And so it is a time where there's prosperity because you have a time of habitation. You have this relative peace, or at least you know who you are and you know where you fit in society, and you feel safe and you feel stable. And so it does allow for people to maybe do other types of cultural pursuits or expand their knowledge in different ways because they have that kind of safety. Now, also at the same time, it is a lot of just peasants being peasants, right? We do have a lot of the average normal people living their life in the state of feudalism and manorialism and contributing in that way to culture. But there are certainly these high points and low points, the Crusades, the bubonic plague, that make this time period not a stagnant line, but something that's going up and down. It's really a fascinating point of history. So I think that idea of Middle Ages is quite misleading. Okay, Sam, throughout the textbook, Bachman treats the experience of Muslims as part of the history of the West. Do you think that that's appropriate? And is Islam part of Western culture during the Middle Ages?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I would say that Islam is definitely part of medieval culture. I think it's really hard to talk about the Middle Ages without talking about Islam. Even in what you were just talking about, when you were talking about the Middle Ages, you made reference to Islamic figures. So it's sort of a yes and no. If you're saying is Islamic culture an inheritor of classical Greco-Roman culture in the same way we see in medieval Western Europe, then I would say, well, yes, they both share that, right? They both are inheritors of that cultural tradition, the Greco-Roman Judeo culture. But at the same time, if we're thinking geographically about what we think of the West, one of the things you might have noticed as we move from Unit 1 to Unit 2 is we're kind of getting a geographic shift. If we think about Unit 1 and we said, well, where would you locate the West? To one degree, it really is kind of Greece and Italy. But then we expand that out to kind of the Mediterranean world. And it's like, that is the West in Unit 1. Now, notice in Unit 2, the kind of axis of what we think of the West has shifted. Instead of being around the Mediterranean world, Southern Europe, North Africa, the western shore, or the western shores of the Middle East, instead of it being there, now the West kind of runs in a line that goes from Rome to Paris to London, and so we're more in France, we're more in Germany, we're more in England. That's more of what we think of as the medieval West. So the idea of West has shifted. Now we know, because of where we're living right now, that West is going to continue to shift, right? In 2024, if we think of the West, we're thinking of Western Europe and particularly America, right? So we're seeing the West move. So is Islam part of Unit 2's vision of the West geographically? Well, not really, although there is interaction. Right, because I think that the point that Islam is an inheritor of classical Greco-Roman culture is really important, because in fact they are the thriving society in the medieval world. You made this case that maybe life in the medieval West is not as backwards as people of the Renaissance want to say, but it is to a degree compared to what's happening in Islamic culture. Islamic culture is spreading, it's thriving. They're making major advances in philosophy, mathematics, the sciences, because they're inheriting that classical Greco-Roman tradition. So you have someone like Averroes, who is studying Greek mathematics, studying Greek and Roman senses of jurisprudence and the law, studying Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, and not only studying those things, but making advances, pushing those ideas further forward. And the medieval West of Western Europe gets to kind of coast off of those things, right? That they get to build off of those things as well. We think about medieval Spain, there's a lot of interaction between Western Christians and Muslims in terms of exchanges of ideas and culture and those types of things, particularly in areas like that where you see those two cultures kind of intersecting. And I think the great example of this is someone like Thomas Aquinas, right? Aquinas is the great intellect of the medieval world. He's the great medieval mind. And he is a lover of the works of Aristotle, but he knows Aristotle through Averroes. So if you were to read more of Aquinas, you'd notice that there are these two figures that he writes about. One of them is this person he calls the philosopher. And when Aquinas says the philosopher, he is talking about Aristotle. He doesn't even need to name him. He is just the philosopher. But there's another character he writes about called the commentator. And the commentator is Averroes, right? So these two figures, Aristotle and Averroes, weigh really heavily for someone like Thomas Aquinas. So it's really essential for thinking about the development of culture in the medieval West. It's essential to think about the role that Islam plays. And then we also have the kind of darker side of that, the flip side of that, which is the Crusades, which is there is this perceived tension between Islam and Christianity that gets manifest in the Crusades in these attempts to sort of win back the Holy Land, push back what's viewed as the encroachment of Islamic culture. And that helps set the tone for the relationship between Christianity and Islam, or between Islam and the West, if we want to think about it that way, for centuries to come. So I think Islam is a really important part of that story, even though it may not be completely appropriate to call Islam a Western religion. It definitely has all these intersections with Western culture, particularly in the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. Annie, if we're thinking about the medieval West and medieval Western culture, one of the essential ideas or pillars of medieval Western culture is the idea of Christendom. What is Christendom? And do you think it's entirely disappeared from Western culture at this point?
Great question. So first of all, let's think about what Christendom means. So we use the phrase Christ's kingdom on earth. It really just means the Christian political state of the Holy Roman Empire. Before I answer what Christendom is, I think it's important to go back and think about where we came from. So what is the plot line so far in CWC in the West, right? So for Christianity, we start out with the birth and death of Jesus. We have the first, the people in the church, the early church, who are in a church that is small, it's separated, it's underground, it's heavily persecuted. And then we move to an era of a lot of growth of Christianity through the passing of the Edict of Milan, making Christianity legal, not state-backed, but making it okay to be a Christian. It is tolerated. So then we have a stretch where Christianity is advantageous in some ways. We have a great growth in converts. And then we move into the time after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and we have this state of Christendom. So now it's not just that Christianity is tolerated, but in fact, it's the religion of the land. So in that trajectory, we see more and more power and authority being placed within the church, within religious leaders. And so for Christendom, it's described as being a two swords theory. So there's basically two functions or two groups. There's the religious and there's the secular. So the religious is made up of religious or sacred leaders, popes, or the hierarchy within the church. And then the secular is made up of kings and political leaders. And the theory is that these two swords, the secular and the religious, that they work together. They function as one. They have the same kind of goal and outcome, and they complement each other's strengths in order to be yielded as one single weapon. And so the sacred and religious leaders tend to people's soul and to the afterlife, where the secular leaders are basically taking care of everything else, right? Your needs as a human, your basic needs. As citizens, your safety, the peace of the state, politics and economics, but they're all interconnected. They're married. And it's important to note that in this type of Christendom, yes, the political realm has its own function, but it all falls under Christianity. And that's because the hierarchy of the medieval world is one where God is always at the top, right? So whether it's in a university, God is at the top of that hierarchy, above professors, above any of the intellectual leaders within a university. Within the church, God is above the Pope. God ordains that hierarchy below. And in the political realm too, God is the leader first and foremost. And so any religious ruler is ordained by God, right? Like underneath God's authority. So it is married, but you can see how maybe there are some tensions that could arise from that kind of a system. It's important to realize that this is also a component of stability in the medieval world, right? So I talked about that idea of the medieval world being an epoch of habitation. A lot of that comes from the fact that all of life is ordered, and at the top of the order is God. So in feudalism, in manorialism, above any of those rulers or those leaders, you have God's authority, that it's all God ordained. And the result is that you see a collaboration and a coherence between the two swords of religious leaders and secular leaders, but you also see a tension between them because they do have strengths that they complement. They do have a lot of main similar goals, but there are some different goals and different values and different ends. And so you start to see a tension between the leaders of the church and the leaders of the government. You might have a pope who wants to take over some of the political decision making, and even own armies. Or you might have secular rulers who want to appoint people to religious institutions, religious offices, and some of that for their own political gain. And so the result is that political powers are God ordained, and that can be problematic, right? Kings and leaders, they gained their power from God and from the protection of the church when they were in the church's favor, but they're not always in the church's favor. So you kind of see some of those tensions play out in the medieval world. And I think we don't have Christendom today in the US, but there are some lingering aspects in our culture. So again, if we're thinking of that plot line of Christianity in the West, we're still there, right? We are still Christians in the West. So we want to make sense of where we're at and how much we have inherited from this time period. The church the Catholic Church still has a massive amount of power, wealth, and prestige. There's over 1 billion Catholics in the world, and the head of the Catholic Church is still the Pope. There's a lot of influence. They look to that individual as someone who is God ordained, who helps to influence not only the religious realm, but also the political realm. And you have the evangelical church in the United States that also has a lot of power and authority. Certainly we see in our politics that religious institutions will fund political campaigns and endorse individuals. Even though in countries like the US, they're technically maybe not allowed to do that, like because of tax exemption and other things, you still see that. You might even have a pastor from the pulpit influencing who to vote for. So there are some lingering aspects of the question of, should the church and state be separate, which is what we inherited in the United States, or does there need to be a little bit of overlap? I was actually looking last night at a Pew Research poll from 2021. So I'm just going to read a little bit of it because I think it's kind of fascinating. So the research poll was asking questions about the separation of church and state. Like, where are we at as American citizens? How do we view this separation? And yes, the vast majority say, like, we like how it is. We like the status quo of the church is a different institution. The political realm is a different institution. They shouldn't overlap. But that doesn't mean there isn't a big chunk of people who do believe that things should be more coherent. So in the research poll, it said 3 in 10 believe that public school teachers should be allowed to lead students in Christian prayers, a practice that the Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional. 1 in 5 believe that the federal government should stop enforcing the separation of church and state, and that the United States Constitution was inspired by God. And 15% of people in the poll said that the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation. So there are a significant amount of people, at least based on this research, that would say, yeah, we need to move in a trajectory more towards a relationship between church and state where they're collaborating more than they are now. And we even have a state like Oklahoma, the most recent state to mandate the Bible being taught in public schools. So yes, we're in a post-Enlightenment era. Yes, we have separation of church and state. Those are good. It's an ideal that we have. The majority of Americans would say so, right? That the religious realm and the political realm, they function differently, that they shouldn't be overlapping. I don't think it's a definitive answer. I don't think that we can really say that Christendom has a great, that it's embedded in our life in Western culture in the 21st century. But I think there are some remnants there, and it's an interesting thing to wrestle with. Like, where do we fall on that spectrum? And what are things that we can learn from the Christendom of the medieval world? So, some lingering aspects. Sam, we have a medieval museum, and it has to do with medieval theology and the practice of the sacraments. What do 21st century Protestants tend to misunderstand about the sacraments?
I love this question because I will say in my own story, I think I've talked about this on previous webisodes. I grew up Catholic. I came to Bethel when I was a student, with that being my religious background. And then I really got kind of ingrained in understanding, learning about Protestantism while I was here. So I feel like I have both of those experiences shape how I think religiously. But it's also, I think, fascinating then to think about, well, how do Catholics think about the sacraments versus how do Protestants think about them in the 21st century? And I think the first thing we need to start with is to understand that the medieval church is foreign to us, right? Like, there are different ideas there. And I also think we need to understand that I'm trying to be very careful about using the phrase medieval Christians as opposed to Catholics, because I think it's not an easy one-to-one to say, well, the medieval church is the Catholic Church. Because like with everything over the last, several hundred or several centuries, theology develops both within Protestantism but also within Catholicism. So it's not an easy one-to-one to think about that way. So what do I think is misunderstood about sort of the medieval practice of the sacraments? I think one of the first things that I notice is people tend to talk about a medieval view of the sacraments in a kind of works righteousness way, right? They'll say, like, well, okay, yeah, so you do these things and then you get to be saved. So then basically you're earning your salvation through your works. And I think that's an oversimplification of how medieval Christians thought about those things. Because I think it's easy to take any religious practice, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, or anything else, and if you warp them a little bit, it becomes a legalistic works righteousness kind of viewpoint. I think that happens within Protestantism as well. I think the thing to think about with the sacraments is that ultimately they are about grace. They're about how do we understand God's grace working in us? And grace is that thing that saves us. And the sacraments are there to guide you through your life. So from the very beginning of your life at baptism to the very end of your life with last rites, right? The sacraments are there to be these representations of God's grace. And for medieval Christians, they're literal channels of God's grace. You're participating in God's grace as you're participating in the sacraments. So I think that's part of it. I think in particular, a sacrament that gets really misunderstood is penance. So I want to say a little bit more about that. One thing to think about when we think about the sacrament of penance is that for medieval Christians, sin really matters. Sin has a real impact. Sin affects us. And the way that it affects us is it damages our relationships. It damages our relationship with God, right? Sin separates us from God. It pushes us apart from God. But sin also damages our relationships here on this earth, right? When I sin, it damages my relationship to the people who I have sinned against, to the world around me, sometimes the physical world around me, the natural world, to the culture around me, right? That sin damages those relationships. And what penance is about is how do we reconcile, how do we deal with the effects of sin in this world? Now, what I think is important about the sacrament of penance is that you are not forgiven because you do penance. It's important to note, like when if you're a medieval Christian, you go and confess your sins, right? For one thing, confessing your sins and repenting, very biblical, right? Christ says this all the time, right? Repent. So you come and repent, and you show real contrition for your sins. And upon doing that, your sins are absolved. And what that means is that relationship between you and God is healed, right? That is reconciled. Penance, you're not doing penance to heal your relationship with God. God has already forgiven you. God's grace has already washed over that. What penance is about is that sort of horizontal component of sin. How do you deal with the effects of your sin in the world around you? So penance is not a punishment for sin. Penance is about reconciliation, and it's about purification, right? You're not saved by doing works of penance. What you're doing is you're purifying yourself, and you're purifying the things that have been damaged by your sin. And that's I think an idea that we tend to miss when we look at medieval Christians, is we think, well, grace is just about salvation. So if we talk about penance and grace, then that means you're doing this penitential work to be saved. That's not it. It is about reconciliation. So in fact, when I grew up, going to Catholic school, that was the word we used to talk about penance. And as a sacrament it was the sacrament of reconciliation, about dealing with the effects of sin. And I actually think that that's a pretty important thing to think about, is like, medievals, I think, are onto something when they think about the fact that, sin is not just this darkness within me or something like that, but it has real ramifications. And there's ways that we maybe need to think about the effects of our sin in this world. So a lot to think about there. That is all the time we have for this first segment. We'll be back in a few seconds to dive a little bit deeper into some more medieval topics. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're going to play a little game of Make the Case. Annie, last time we played this, you beat me 2-1 in student vote. So I'm back to take the crown this time. I'm going to win. I'm going to try to sweep all three of these, make the best case that I can. We have 3 questions. We don't know what answers we're going to get. So the first question Thomas Aquinas is the greatest Christian theologian since Augustine. True or false? Annie, whoever gets true will go first. So let's open up our envelopes.
I love doing this. It's so exciting. Ooh.
So I got true. So
Oh,
I will go first.
all right.
Why is Aquinas the most important theologian since Augustine? Why is that a true statement? For one thing, I think Aquinas is so important because he, in some ways, is a counterbalance to Augustine. We talked about Augustine in Unit 1 and this large shadow that he casts, and especially he casts on the Middle Ages. But Aquinas is almost a corrective to that, and it has to do with Greek philosophy, because Augustine is very Platonic. When you read Confessions, and we talked about that, like Augustine comes to God through reading Plato. Or the works of Platonic philosophy, and he kind of thinks about God in a Platonic way, and Aquinas is very Aristotelian, and what that means is that Aquinas thinks about this world a lot more. In fact, Aquinas is pretty optimistic about this world and about human reason. Now, part of that is context. Aquinas is living in a world of Christendom, right? He is living at the peak of medieval Christendom in the 13th century, in the 1200s. It is a prosperous time. Church and state are working together. Both of these things are sort of at their pinnacle in terms of medieval influence. And Aquinas thinks about human reason, and he says, actually, human reason can do a lot. It is a powerful thing. He says we can know a lot of things through reason alone. We can even know that God exists just by using reason. Right? He says reason isn't everything. It's not perfect, but it is very powerful. Hence, we get this idea from Aquinas that faith perfects reason. You start with reason. Reason can tell you a lot of things, but then we add to reason what we know through faith, what we know through Scripture, to get more perfect knowledge. Hence, faith perfects the work that reason begins. So Aquinas is going to really wrap his arms around human reason and thinking about this world, and thinking to a medieval sense scientifically or rationally about this world, but then also embracing this world of faith and this world of religion. And this is what, when we talk about medieval synthesis, this is what we're talking about. To synthesize something, things are to bring them together and bind them together. And that's what Aquinas is doing. He's saying, really, we can think about all knowledge, all human understanding in this kind of synthesis of faith and reason. So he does that. And this deeply shapes particularly Catholic theology. If you were to go to most of the major Catholic universities and study theology, you're going to study theology through a Thomistic lens most of the time, right? That there is this sense that faith and reason can shake hands, faith and reason can work together. And he shapes medieval Christianity in that way, and he sort of lays that groundwork. So I think he's important because he counterbalances what we see with Augustine. We're going to see other important theologians. I'm going to try to guess somebody Annie's going to say. Annie might mention, she might try to, this is where I'm trying to win this. She might try to make the case that, someone like Martin Luther, this great Protestant thinker in the 1500s, he's the real inheritor. He's the real next best theologian. But when we study Martin Luther in the second half of this unit, he's basically just reiterating Augustinian theology, where Aquinas is serving as this kind of counterbalance. Annie, make your case.
Wow. Okay. He stole my thunder. But okay, I will acknowledge Aquinas matters a lot. But is he the greatest? I don't know. So I think he is one of the most important philosophers since the Greco-Roman world. Yes. And as a theologian, clearly incredibly important. That the Catholic Church is Thomistic says a lot. But is he the only systematic theologian? No. Is he the most important? I would say no. So I'm going to look at the Reformation. Yes, you called my bluff. Yes, I'm going to go talk about Martin Luther. But even before that, let's think about other reformers that students will come across later in this class. Someone like John Calvin. If you're a Protestant theologian, you have to wrestle with John Calvin. Even to this day, you have churches that are very Calvinist and churches that are very not Calvinist, and they will make it known. And he is somebody who is also a systematic theologian. He brings systems and structures to Protestant Christianity. But the big individual, I would say, is more important or greater theologian than Aquinas would be Martin Luther. Yeah. So why do I think that? Yes, he did take a lot of Augustine's work and revamped it, revitalizes it. But at the same time, he did something very new. He created a new method of theology. And I think that that's essential. Coming out of Martin Luther's theology, we have inherited this idea of sola scriptura, especially within Protestant churches. So sola scriptura means that we only look to scripture as our source of authority for understanding who God is, understanding who we are in Christ. And so we look to scripture itself for the answers to major questions about our faith. And that's where we go. We don't go to a church authority first. We don't go and listen to our pastor without even thinking about what scripture has to say for itself. So while Aquinas's work ends up really shaping the medieval church and the medieval system, it also kind of reaffirms medieval views and medieval beliefs. But Luther, however, is coming in to kind of interrogate a lot of those systems that existed, the status quo of Christian belief in the medieval world. And his method of doing so, his method of theology, is to go back to the Word of God. So it's not about established systems. It's not about church structure or hierarchy. Instead, it's about what does Scripture have to say about questions on faith. So I think that I would say Martin Luther is incredibly important for Christians today. That I think a lot of us, especially at Bethel, have inherited that idea, that method of sola scriptura as scripture alone for our way to wrestle with theology. Yeah, that's my argument.
All right. Question 2. True or false, the 14th century is the worst century in human history. True will go first again, and that is me again. So I'm making the case that the 14th century, the 1300s, is the worst century in human history. So what do we point to, right? I would say, when we think about the 14th century, we have, I mean, one of the big things. Let's just get our big cards out on the table right away. We have something called the Black Death or the bubonic plague. Now, this is not merely something that happens in Western Europe. This is really happening throughout. It hits places in Africa. It comes out of Central Asia. So this is going to be an Asian epidemic. An African epidemic, particularly in our story, a European epidemic. We all of us listening to this have been through a global pandemic with COVID, but that is nothing compared to the Black Death. Within 2 or 3 years of the Black Death coming to Europe, a quarter to a third of the population died. The Black Death does not care about wealth. It does not care about status. It does not care about age. It does not care about religion. It wipes out and fundamentally changes the way people think about life, the way people experience life, the way people live life. I mean, imagine having death to that degree so present in your life, right? So the Black Death alone, I mean, we see death totals, like, the only place we can see that is when we think about 20th century world wars, right? And this is coming rapidly through a disease that people do not have the scientific capacity to understand, right? So it is entirely mysterious in that way. So we get that. That's a big problem. Add to it, we get warfare. We get warfare in places where there really hasn't been warfare for centuries. Part of why the 100 Years' War matters so much is because throughout the Middle Ages, although we think about the Middle Ages as, like, about kings and knights and things like that, there's not a lot of major warfare within Western Europe, within Christendom. But the 100 Years' War changes that, because you have England and France in this long-standing war, which lasts over 100 years, and you have Christian armies slaughtering Christian armies.
Mhm.
That raises questions, right? That leads to a breakdown in this ideal of Christendom that Annie was talking about in segment 1, right? This idea that we're all together living under Christian kings, we're all part of this same church. We see the rise of national identities which shake that up. That is a major crisis. Third major crisis, we have the Great Schism. We have the calling into question the legitimacy of the church. We have two people claiming to be Pope, one in Avignon, France, and one in Rome. This causes people in Western Europe to question Christendom, because it's based on this idea of these hierarchies established by God, to question Christianity in general, saying, wait a minute, if the Pope is supposed to be Christ's representative on earth and there's no salvation outside of the church and the church hierarchy, then which hierarchy is the right one? It causes people to say, is the church a legitimate authority at all? Or is this just human politics at play, right? This is a crisis which threatens the existence of Christianity, to the extent that even after this is resolved in the early 1400s, there are lingering questions about this, that it's going to take us up to the Reformation in the 16th century for people to start to address and wrestle with some of those questions. So we have massive diseases taking lives. We have war, we have pandemic, or we have crisis within the church. We have populations plummeting, and all of the questions that come along that. And I think it's important that, again, this is happening in a time period where people don't have the scientific knowledge to even understand why this is happening. So you don't know how things are going to end, or if things are going to end. Annie, make your case that this is not the worst century.
All right, I love being the contrarian on both of these. I think similar to the last question, I feel like I have to come up with then an alternative. What is the other century that would be worse than the 14th century? And you already mentioned that century. The 20th century would be the one that I would say is the worst. And why I say that is, yes, there is no doubt that the bubonic plague was like nothing we've ever seen before historically. But a lot of the other issues mentioned were geographically quite Western. And maybe the greatest toll or the greatest impact of those issues were within Europe. So I'm going to take a non-Eurocentric perspective and say that the worst century was the century of the 20th. And that's because it is the most widespread global impact. So in the 20th century, we also had pandemic outbreaks. We had influenza with 20 to 40 million deaths between 1918 to 1920. Ever heard of the Great Depression? Yeah, that started in the United States, but it had the collapse then of the world economy. Just look up any pictures from the Great Depression, and that should be a really good indicator for you that this was a rough time to be alive. We had World War I. We had two world wars back to back. World War I resulted in 40 million deaths globally. World War II, 75 million deaths. And they weren't just sustained in Europe, but they were impacting basically every continent of the world, maybe not Antarctica. But you have deaths around the world. Asia's involved, Europe's involved, Africa's involved. Warfare, fighting happening on all of those continents. And even the United States had its own attacks on its soil. So we see warfare spreading out throughout the world twice. And then we have genocides. The term genocide did not exist until the 20th century with the Jewish genocide during World War II, but also the genocide of the Armenians. We have the Cold War, which resulted in hot wars or hot battles happening in Vietnam and Korea over political ideology. So yes, maybe our religious institutions weren't as shook as they were in the 14th century, but we have political systems that are warring with each other that make us have our own existential crises. We have the HIV and AIDS pandemic starting in the 1980s, and that resulted in tens of millions of deaths. So yes, the 20th century has like higher life expectancy, less infant death or infant mortality rates, There's more wealth globally. There's improvements in modern medicine. Like for many ways, this is a huge improvement in growth. But in the end, it's really hard to say which one of these two is worse. And I'm going to say that the 14th century might just be the worst for Europe, not the world.
All I have to say is if I had to pick which century I wanted to live in, I would pick the 20th century. Last question, Annie, we'll have you go first on this. What is the biggest lesson that 21st century American Christians can learn from medieval Christians?
Okay. I think that one of the biggest lessons to learn, I do think it really comes with the idea of Christendom and looking back. I know I already mentioned this in the first bit of this webisode, but I think the idea of the marrying of religion and secular, of those two swords, is something that is becoming more and more relevant to this day in our politics, in our religion. Certainly when we think about what do we want out of political leaders, that this is an election year. And so there's a lot of questions that we have to wrestle with of who do we want to lead us as a country? And what does that person look like? What are their morals? What are their beliefs? And how does that impact, or should it impact their policy? Whether it's a law, passing legislation that would be morally important for me as a Christian, or how the court is ruling, or how the executive office is running. Should those be connected to a certain set of religious beliefs, or should they be divorced from religion? Where do we stand on that issue? So I think that that's really important. But even more than that, I want to say maybe the biggest lesson to learn for me personally was the idea of order and hierarchy. Because I think that was the most difficult part for me to empathize with when I was studying CWC for the first time, is the idea of hierarchy being positive. Because for me, living in the post-Enlightenment world, living as somebody who values individual achievement, who values my ability to move between my economic status, or even move throughout the world and have freedom in the way that we have in Western 21st century. It's hard for me to think about a system that has these rigid placements of individuals to be something that is freeing, or to be something that would provide people with security and safety, and actually make them feel good. So I think for me, it's important to remember that this time period, the majority of people are illiterate, uneducated. The economies are very local, and mostly agrarian. And there are small wars happening throughout the medieval world between different factions and tribes. And so it's interesting and important for me to think about how problems were actually solved in this era, and how life could have been navigated coming out of the system of collapse in the Roman Empire. And so is this system abusive? Well, certainly it could be, right? And certainly it was, but also, did it meet the needs of people? It's not maybe all bad. And for me, it's important for me to think about this as a gray area, right? To consider that maybe this period of order and hierarchy really did serve the majority of people for that time period in that context. It's important for us to also consider, when do we condemn or oppose those systems of potential abuse, whether religious or political? And especially in an era where we have civil rights, where human rights are important, and those notions are all going to arise in the Enlightenment era that you'll learn about in Unit 3. But evergreen issue, and it's interesting to rethink about the medieval world as not a period of just abuse and stagnation, but again, realizing that there's a lot of gray area, and there's actually a lot of interesting parts and perspectives to consider. So that's kind of my lesson that I'd learned. How about you, Sam?
I would say that the lesson that I think would be most important, and I'll just use I statements for me to remember and learn, is that for medieval Christians, the veil between this world and the next is permeable. And what I mean by that is that they lived in a world where they really believed that the world was a spiritual world, right? Things from the spiritual realm had touched the things of this world in real direct ways. I mean, think about Hildegard of Bingen as a mystic, or just they're just this sense of like real spiritual presence in the world. And I will say, I am so impacted, and I think a lot of us, if we're being honest, are impacted by things like the scientific revolution of the 17th century, right? We think about things rationally, we think about things scientifically. And what I mean by that is that if we encounter a phenomena that seems strange to us, our first response is to say there has to be some explanation. There has to be a rational explanation. There has to be a scientific explanation. I mean, if I were to go home today and my wife started telling me about visions like Hildegard of Bingen's, my first response would, if I'm thinking about instinctually, would probably not be, well, clearly God is speaking to you. I would be, okay, did you eat something strange? Did something like, you're having a reaction to something, right? Some sort of chemical reaction. And eventually I might come around to saying like, okay, maybe this is a vision, right? You know, this kind of mystical vision. But I think there is something to be said about opening myself up to the way medievals thought about the world a little bit more, because they really, you know, if the scientific revolution kicks off an age of reason, the Middle Ages is an age of faith. And I think there is something that we potentially lose when we over embrace some of these things, that everything must have a rational explanation, to the extent that even if we don't know what that rational explanation is, we just assume, well, it's there, we just need to find it. And it's like, maybe there are mysteries in this world. Maybe there are things that transcend reason and science in terms of the kind of why explanations. And I think I could learn from medievals to be more open to that. So to me, that's a lesson. Whenever I study the Middle Ages, like, I'm always taken aback by the degree to which they do live life through a lens of faith to a far greater extent than I do, because of that. And I think there's something I can learn from that. Students, for tomorrow, we have a poodle response for you, and we want you to answer this question in a similar way. What are 2 lessons that you, as a 21st century person, can learn from the people of the Middle Ages? What did they get right that we might be getting wrong? So when you talk about lessons, I don't want to hear they did this and we shouldn't do that. I want to hear, what are the things that they're doing where you're like, you know, we could actually learn from that. Maybe we've abandoned some of those things that might be valuable for us to take a step back and consider and say, maybe having a viewpoint, a worldview like theirs a little bit, actually would be helpful. So by 10 a.m. tomorrow, create a poodle video explaining two lessons that you think 21st century Christians can learn from, or 21st century people can learn from the Middle Ages. Also, we will have a poll on Moodle to vote to see who won Make the Case, who gave the more compelling reasons. Think about all the great stuff that I said about Aquinas, about the 14th century. You know, like those were, I made pretty good cases. So go on and vote for who you think won. That's all the time that we have for this segment. We'll be right back to wrap up the show.
Welcome back. It's happy time. So sorry, I'm distracted. I was just thinking about all of my great answers for Make the Case. But let's do happy time. Happy birthday to Jake LaMotta. The American boxer was born on this day in 1922. LaMotta is perhaps most famously remembered as the subject of Martin Scorsese's 1980 film Raging Bull, for which Robert De Niro won the Oscar for Best Actor. Raging Bull is one of the most highest ranked biopics on the 2022 Sight and Sound list of the greatest films of all time, coming out in number 129. Sam, I love the way that you intricately weave in these different things to get you to a question about movies.
Yes.
What is the best biopic ever?
Raging Bull is really good. You could make the case that that's the best, but I think it's 1992's Malcolm X, directed by Spike Lee. Denzel Washington plays Malcolm X. I think that is maybe the pinnacle of biopics. Now, it's interesting because biopics often will do well in Best Picture voting, and often for like acting awards, a lot of acting awards. I mean, think about last year, Oppenheimer. You know, you have Cillian Murphy winning for Oppenheimer, but biopics often don't have a long standing, like if you look at the greatest movies of all time, you're often not seeing biopics on there. But I think Spike Lee's Malcolm X from 1992 is probably the best version of a biopic. So if you haven't seen it, students, it's really long, but it's really great. Happy anniversary to the state of Wyoming. On this day in 1890, Wyoming was officially admitted as the 44th state in the Union. Annie, what is your favorite fact about the state of Wyoming?
Good question. I did have to look up facts in order to come up with a favorite. And my favorite is not what its state bird is or its state drink or whatever. In fact, there's a guy in Wyoming who's running right now for mayor of Cheyenne. Is that the capital? Are we confirming that, Sam? That's a head shake. Okay, we think so. So he's running for mayor of Cheyenne with an AI as his running mate. I think its name is AI Steve. I don't really know. So I'm like, well, that's fascinating. Way to go, Wyoming. All right, happy trails to Mel Blanc. The American voice actor known as the Man of a Thousand Voices died on this day in 1989. Blanc famously was the voice of classic animated characters for both Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera. Sam, what is your favorite Mel Blanc voice?
This is actually really hard because he is the voice of so many animated characters, like all of the Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny and Sylvester and Tweety and Tasmanian Devil, and he's Barney Rubble in the
Oh,
Flintstones. He's all, I mean, if you've seen American animation from the 20th century, you've heard the voice of Mel Blanc because he does everything. But I think his greatest character is Daffy Duck. I really think Daffy is, um, this might be sacrilegious to Disney fans, but I think Daffy Duck is the superior animated duck to Donald. And Donald is maybe the best like classic Disney character. Daffy Duck is pretty amazing. So I'm gonna go with Daffy Duck. I feel like I have offended you. I will
wow.
give you 10 seconds to make a rebuttal.
It's just a bold take. That's all. I haven't heard it before. I'm proud of you for saying it out loud. I think you'll have a lot of people disagreeing, but that's
Okay,
fine.
then I will say this. If the greatest scene in I think it's 1987 or 88's Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the dueling pianos between Daffy Duck and Donald Duck. It's the best merging of Warner Brothers and Disney characters in that movie. So go onto YouTube and watch that. It's pretty great. That is all the time that we have, students. Remember, if you have questions, feel free to email me. Um, Remember, your poodle video is due tomorrow by 10 a.m. Let us know what are two things that 21st century people can learn from people of the Middle Ages. And remember to vote for Make the Case. That is all the time that we have. We will be back with another webisode before exam 2. Say goodnight, Stacy.